So hi, welcome everyone. We're really excited about the interest in this webinar and thrilled that so many of you are tuning in. In light of our new digital world, this series is highlighting local climate leaders working in the Bay Area on issues relating to making our world more resilient. In case this is your first time joining us, Greenbelt Alliance is a nonprofit based here in the Bay Area, and our mission is to educate, advocate, and collaborate to make the Bay Area's lands and communities more resilient to a changing climate. Today, we're lucky to be joined by Sona Mohnot, the Environmental Equity Program Manager at the Greenlining Institute, a policy, research, organizing, and leadership institute working for racial and economic justice. Growing up in New Orleans, Sona became interested in environmental equity after witnessing the disproportionate environmental burdens that communities of color in New Orleans face, especially after Hurricane Katrina and the BP oil spill. An environmental lawyer by training, at Greenlining, her work focuses on creating equitable climate adaptation and resilience strategies to help ensure that communities hit first and worst thrive in spite of it. Sona, thank you so much for joining us for our Conversations with Climate Leaders series. All right, let's jump in. Sona, let's start by, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself, where you grew up, and how you started taking an interest in environmental equity work?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me okay, Zoe?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Thanks so much for the introduction and for inviting me today. Really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about myself as well as the work that I'm doing at the Greenlining Institute as it involves climate resilience. So as you just mentioned, yeah, I grew up, spent most of my time in New Orleans, and I moved to the Bay about 4 years ago. I think my time in New Orleans really shaped who I am today and why I'm not just interested in environmental equity, but really personally invested in this work. Growing up in New Orleans, I learned a lot about, good food, good music, how to celebrate life, the importance of community. And it also taught me a lot about what environmental injustice and environmental racism can look like through, as you mentioned, Hurricane Katrina, the BP oil spill, and so many other climate disasters. And I was just thinking, right now we're in the middle of summer, and each year when I was in New Orleans at about this time, everyone would be start preparing for hurricane season, whether it's stocking up on food and water or boarding up windows if there was a really severe climate or a hurricane headed our way, and just kind of checking in with family and friends to make sure that they had what they needed. And so even as a kid, summertime for me was on one hand really exciting. We had a nice long break from school, got to spend time outside. And at the same time, it was also a little bit anxiety inducing because you didn't know how bad the hurricanes or tropical storms would be. And when I was a senior in high school, that's when Hurricane Katrina hit, and our high school had primarily low-income students of color, and my high school closed for several months, and after it reopened, a lot of my friends and their families weren't able to come back. And a lot of the folks that were most impacted were a lot of Black and Vietnamese residents that lived in parts of the city that weren't safe from floodwaters. They weren't well maintained. They had a lot of failing infrastructure, and they were in parts of the city where the levees failed. And so after high school, I stayed in New Orleans for college and law school, and really got to see, how disproportionate the rebuilding efforts after the storm were, and how some neighborhoods where largely Black communities lived are still to this day, almost 15 years ago, largely uninhabited, haven't really been rebuilt, and in a lot of ways, they just resemble ghost towns. And this was in, really stark contrast to other parts of the city, like areas in the French Quarter or in wealthier neighborhoods that had resources to rebuild much faster. And I know this is a long story, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time sharing it because it's really what opened my eyes to environmental racism and injustice. And at the time, you would see news stories depicting Black people as looting after the hurricane and white people as finding food after the hurricane, which was really unbelievable. And the storm and the rebuilding efforts afterwards, I think, really visibilized the deep legacy of kind of neglect and racism that's always been a part of the city's history, but really came to the surface during the storm and after. And even though I didn't have the vocabulary to really name what I was seeing at the time, I knew it was wrong and it was hurting so many people and families and communities in the city. And that's really what I guess, moved me to focus on environmental equity. And so after law school, I was fortunate enough to join the Greenlining Institute and have been here for almost 4 years, focusing on equitable climate adaptation and resilience policy.
Wow, that's great. And can you talk a bit more about your work, your climate resilience work at Greenlining?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who aren't familiar with Greenlining, just wanted to share a little bit of background. So Greenlining's a racial and economic justice public policy organization, and we're based in Oakland, California. That's where I am right now as well. And we do statewide advocacy. Our mission as an organization is to have a nation where race is never a barrier to opportunity and where communities of color thrive. And greenlining, it's a made-up word. It refers to redlining policies. And I'm sure many of the folks who are listening in are familiar, but for those who aren't, redlining was a government-sanctioned policy from the 1930s, where housing agencies and banks literally drew red lines around low-income communities of color, particularly Black communities, and marked them off limits for different investments, loans, banking opportunities, because these communities were seen as credit risks because there was a presence of people of color there. And as a result, redlining policies really restricted communities' access to economic opportunities, home ownership, and being able to build wealth and pass it down through families. And so the lack of investment in communities of color for so many decades has really contributed to the extreme wealth inequality that we see today along race lines. And these neighborhoods didn't just suffer economically, but they were also chosen as sites for where polluting and toxic facilities were located, like oil and gas refineries and other toxic waste sites. And while redlining is technically outlawed decades ago, just imagine decades of disinvestment has really is still impacting communities to this day. And in fact, communities that were formerly redlined in California are the ones that are living in the most polluted areas and suffering the most from poverty as well. And these communities not only experience high pollution burden and economic disadvantage, but they are also living in areas with unsafe infrastructure, they don't have good access to quality transportation, good jobs. And all of these injustices kind of combined really impact and limit a community's ability to cope with different climate disasters when they hit. And so while redlining policies kind of intentionally disinvested in low-income communities of color, at Greenlining, we try to address that by greenlining communities and proactively bringing in investments and resources into our communities that have been neglected for so long. And at our organization, we have several different teams that focus on this. I'm on the environmental equity team, and we work to develop policy solutions that reduce pollution and poverty and build climate resilience. And our climate resilience work is really rooted in understanding that climate impacts harm some communities more than others, especially low-income communities and communities of color that have experienced and continue to experience disinvestment, segregation, poverty, and pollution that kind of results from not just redlining, as I mentioned, but so many other discriminatory policies. Just thinking, for instance, during any sort of climate disaster, a lot of low-income communities might lack the financial kind of safety nets that can serve as a lifeline during different disasters, whether it's having access to a car to escape extreme weather events, or living near safe transit options, or just having savings in case you experience any sort of like health illnesses or unemployment. And so when we're thinking about climate resilience at Greenlining, we're focusing on finding ways to center equity to really protect and support our frontline communities that are being hit hardest by different climate disasters. And to do that work, we work really closely with different policymakers at the state and local level to develop policy strategies that not only build resilience in the physical environment where we live, but that really focus on building community resilience by providing comprehensive health, environmental, social, and economic benefits, because climate impacts don't simply impact our natural environment, but can really exacerbate any sort of existing inequities that individuals and communities are facing. And most importantly, in addition to thinking about resilient strategies that provide multiple benefits, we want to see our communities involved and really robustly engaged in different decision-making processes, not just informed, but really finding ways for them to influence decisions that are going to impact them, because their voices and perspectives have really been left out of these conversations for a long time. So that's a little bit about our resilience work, but I'm sure I'll be able to dive deeper in as we go on in this conversation.
Yeah, that's great. And it's been so great seeing so many more people active and involved in the political sphere during COVID these days. So I know that climate change is exacerbating the injustices that frontline communities face, which is making climate adaptation and the work that you guys are doing even more essential. What do you see as some of the key equity challenges in the climate resilience field right now?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Zoe, and there are a lot of barriers and challenges to advancing equity in the resilience field, but I'll just share a couple ones that are top of mind right now. I think the biggest barrier, and one that's pretty common that everyone knows about, is just the lack of funding around adaptation and resilience. And that's been a huge part of my work for the last year, really thinking about how do we find funding sources for adaptation and resilience, and at the same time make sure that those funds are used and implemented equitably. And I think the last couple of years, we've been able to see some funding for resilience work. For instance, the Cap and Trade program, it's been able to fund like urban forestry and urban greening programs, which can reduce greenhouse gases and also improve air quality and improve like the livability of a neighborhood. And this year, we were also closely tracking the different resilience bond proposals that were introduced by different members of the legislature, as well as the governor. But even with those funding sources, the need is so much greater than the funds that we have available to build resilience to climate impacts in California. And so moving forward, I think the issue of funding is one that our team will continue to work on, recognizing how big the need is. And then I think another challenge that I wanted to name is focused on gentrification and displacement when it comes to climate investments, because we do want to see investments and development going into communities to make them more resilient, to make them healthier, so that they can not only cope with different climate impacts, but so we can also improve the livability of these neighborhoods and build more social cohesion. But what happens often that have been seeing is that as neighborhoods become more appealing to live in, they get more investments, it can raise the market value for home and businesses and price out a lot of residents and businesses that have been there for a really long time. And we're seeing a lot of this kind of green gentrification take place, for instance, like when bike lanes are added in a neighborhood or more parks are there, public transit becomes more accessible, it can lead to a lot of displacement. And so for us, one big challenge and an area that we focus on is how can we have development without displacement, and how can we leverage investments so that residents and businesses and different cultural institutions that have been very present and visible in a neighborhood get to stay there and receive the benefits of any new amenities that are brought into that neighborhood. And so I think just that in and of itself is a huge question, and one that we're constantly grappling with. We don't have any, it's still a big, I think, research gap, and there's still a lot of work to be done there. But I think to start, one of the key lessons that we've been seeing is that it's really important to be proactive. You know, cities and other institutions that are focusing on resilience work, they have to really center equitable development and anti-displacement as they plan for new investments, because it's important to plan and adopt different anti-displacement policies and programs before the investment is even really announced, instead of after, when prices have already gone up and people have already been displaced. And so we want to see in our work more policies, more programs really advocating and including different anti-displacement requirements. It's something that we push for and will continue to advocate for through our work.
Yeah, it's definitely critical to be proactive, and climate gentrification is a big topic right now. And I think, you know, one of the ways that we can be proactive is through getting more funding. Do you know the status, or like, what is the status of the resilience bonds at the state level? Do you know what's going on with that right now?
We I don't know if this has been confirmed yet, but I don't believe it's moving forward this year. That's not to say that it might move forward in the future, but as far as I know, with the latest information I've received, that it's not moving forward.
That's too bad.
Yeah.
Wow. So related to that, and I think, you know, we have so many issues that we're trying to, so many bills that we're trying to pass that are COVID related, that the non-COVID related bills are, you know, not making it through this season. But you know, in light of COVID-19 and in light of the COVID-19 crisis and the racial injustices happening around the country, it seems like the fight for climate justice is more important now than ever before. How has your work and perhaps Greenlining's work changed in response to the simultaneous economic, environmental, health, and racial injustices crises happening simultaneously?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really great question. And I'm sure a lot of other organizations that are listening in today have also had to make pivots to their work to respond, as you mentioned, to the multiple crises that are happening right now. And as a racial and economic justice organization, we've absolutely had to pivot some of our work so that we can respond to that pandemic, the economic crisis that it's creating, especially for communities that we work with that were already low income, might lack access to healthcare, quality jobs, and as I mentioned, just the importance of having financial safety nets in case you are unable to continue working. And so I think in the last few months, we've really been prioritizing putting a COVID lens on all of our work. And in the climate work specifically, we've been developing strategies that can provide economic relief to families while also continuing to help fight climate change and build racial equity, because we recognize that our communities are coping with the current public health and economic crisis, but they've been disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis for years and will continue to be impacted by the climate crisis even after the pandemic is over. And we've also been seeing a lot of reports and data coming out showing that our Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities that were already heavily impacted by air pollution and have a disproportionate rate of people with asthma or other respiratory illnesses, they're also being hit hardest by COVID due to those existing health issues in communities. And our communities are also dying at a disproportionately higher rate due to COVID. And so I think this pandemic has not only really brought to surface these existing disparities, but is in fact has a potential to really widen that gap. And so we're working to connect the dots and show how public health, economic security, and climate change are very intertwined in how they impact people, and how they're also racial justice issues, and that we need policy strategies that provide very intersectional kind of benefits and different protections. And I think one specific way that we've been engaging in conversations around COVID that I wanted to share around COVID and the climate crisis is through the governor's task force on business and jobs recovery. And this task force was established a few months ago, and they're working to figure out what does a path forward look like for COVID-19 recovery. And so Greenlining, along with the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, Scope, and California Relief, we developed a just recovery response letter in response to COVID. And the letter includes a really comprehensive set of principles and specific recommendations for the task force that focus on creating a triple bottom line of advancing equity, economic opportunity, as well as building climate resilience for communities. And the letter provides different recommendations across a wide number of sectors, including the economy, environmental justice, technology, civic engagement, and so many more. And we were able to get over 100 organizations to sign on to that letter, which was really exciting because there's a lot of momentum, I think, from different groups around the state to advance these types of recommendations and strategies. And the letter is on our Greenlining website in case anyone wants to look over it. But I would say that's kind of been a really big pivot in the work that I'm doing, as well as the work on my team. And so right now we are working to find ways to advance the recommendations that we developed and engage with different members of the task force, and also see if we can move some of these ideas through other mechanisms like the legislation perhaps next year.
Yeah, and Greenbelt was proud to sign on to that letter, and we would love to help support it in any other way we can. And you know, we've touched on a few heavy topics already, but I'm curious where you think there's, you know, progress being made around environmental equity and resilience, and or you know, where you're hopeful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think right now, as you mentioned, things are feeling really heavy and there's a lot of work that needs to happen, but I am feeling hopeful, and I wanted to share a couple of different opportunities that we're working on that we're really excited and hopeful about. The first one is related to the task force work that we've been doing. We developed a proposal to establish a statewide office of racial equity in an effort to kind of address racial disparities through structural interventions. And the idea is that this office would identify and address existing policies and practices in the state that contribute to or make racial disparities worse. And the office would also support different capacity building for state agencies and provide technical assistance so that they have the strategies they need to adopt to advance racial equity, like through different employee training and support programs, and supporting the development of racial equity programming within agencies to improve racial equity outcomes. And the idea would be that, you know, any law or policy that the state of California moves forward, they'd essentially have to apply a racial equity lens or some sort of equity screening process to see how the policy might benefit or burden already marginalized communities, so that we can really practice, you know, how do we make equity real so that it's not just something that we're talking about and striving for, but that we have actual strategies to achieve it. So that's one really exciting idea that we've been working on, and it's included in our task force letter as well. And the another one that we are feeling really hopeful about is we're working closely on developing an integrated mapping platform to identify different populations that are most vulnerable to climate impacts. Because right now, California doesn't have a way to identify communities that are most vulnerable to climate change. But we need this kind of tool and this information to make sure that we're preparing the state for different emergencies, and that we're really protecting communities proactively rather than after the fact. And a lot of the thinking behind this idea was done by the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, and they published a report last fall called Mapping Resilience, and they reviewed dozens of different climate threat and like climate assessment frameworks. And one of their findings is that there's a need for this type of comprehensive climate vulnerability mapping platform that looks at climate projections as well as socioeconomic conditions and different adaptive capacity factors that can contribute to a community's vulnerability. And the idea is that with this information, our policymakers will have the data and information that they need to protect California's most vulnerable populations from different climate threats. That's another really exciting piece of work that we're doing. And the last one that I did want to share real quickly is that we've been closely following and supporting ACA 5, which is the constitutional amendment that will be on California's November ballot, and it would essentially reverse Proposition 209, which is a law that got rid of affirmative action in California. And so ACA 5 will repeal Prop 209 and will really help level the playing field in terms of public employment and government contracting and public education, and create more opportunities for folks who have been left out of those different sectors. So yeah, those are just a couple of things that I'm feeling really hopeful about in this moment, and we'll continue working on.
Wow, that's great. There sounds like there's a lot to be hopeful about right now. I have a couple other questions, but I do see that we have a number of questions from the audience, and I would love to get to a couple of those in our last few minutes. Do you want to take a glance at them? Do you want me to ask them to you?
Sure, I can take a look.
Thinking the first one looks.
Great. So I think the first one's talking about manage retreat, and the question is, how do you approach the option of manage retreat as one of the options for climate change adaptation, especially in communities and neighborhoods in disadvantaged portions of the population? Are there any examples in the Bay Area? I personally have not seen any examples of managed retreat that's done with a strong equity lens. It's also not an area that I have a lot of expertise or knowledge in, but I think there are a lot of equity concerns that can come up with managed retreat. And so I think it's a really important conversation to be having, especially in the Bay Area when we're talking about climate impacts and equity. I think a lot of communities through redlining have been forced into areas that aren't protected from flooding, that aren't protected from sea level rise, and are now facing a new burden of having to be displaced once again due to rising sea levels. And so for a lot of communities, that can be extremely disruptive. It can break up a lot of social cohesion and networks that you need to survive a different climate threat or disaster. And so I think if we are talking about managed retreat, because I understand that sometimes, you know, if a certain area is going to be subjected to sea level rise, we of course don't want people to be harmed by that. But it's not necessarily a black or white answer. And so I think there are a lot of equity considerations that need to go into or be a part of that conversation. And most importantly, to speak with community members that are going to be impacted by any potential managed retreat conversations or discussions, to make sure that we're kind of hearing what their concerns are and listening to what strategies we can implement to really minimize that disruption. But I think it's a great question, one that we absolutely need to spend more time thinking about.
Yeah, managed retreat is definitely a tricky but potentially essential conversation to have, especially in the Bay Area.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you mentioned the concept of development without displacement. Do you have any examples of like where that has been successful? I know it's kind of like a quintessential planning concept, but not as many places that have good examples from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've seen different policies that have tried to implement anti-displacement mechanisms in them. And the one that's coming to mind is the Transformative Climate Communities Program. The program has a really strong emphasis on development without displacement, investments without displacement. And you might have to double check me on this, but I think the law that created the program, AB 2570 or 2277, sorry, I might be getting the number confused. I believe it has anti-displacement is kind of one of the components of the program. And so that's in statute, and then it showed up in the different program guidelines as well. And that program, if you look through the TCC guidelines for the Transformative Climate Communities Program, it has a long list of different anti-displacement strategies to keep residents in place, as well as small businesses and cultural institutions. And so the idea is that, you know, as different communities receive those grants for a TCC project, it would be able to include some of those anti-displacement measures proactively, so that, as I mentioned, we're focusing on how are we preventing displacement before prices begin to rise in a community. So I would definitely encourage folks to check out that program to kind of learn more about what it looks like to, include anti-displacement language in a law and then follow it through the implementation of that law.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, we're just about out of time, but I did want to ask you, what do you want rising climate leaders to know most?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Zoe. I appreciate the question. I think what's top of mind for me right now is that we can't go back to normal, whatever that means, whatever that looked like. I think I was just reflecting when the pandemic first hit California, we were seeing a lot of things happen that we thought would not have been able to, that would have been impossible pre-COVID, like a ban on evictions, housing for the houseless, free medical service, like honestly, just a lot of basic necessities. And we don't want to see these really important things only become critical during a crisis, because our communities have been experiencing different socioeconomic and environmental injustices for decades, for centuries now. And so we should not be aiming to go for things to go back to normal after this crisis ends, because the status quo is why our communities are suffering and facing so many injustices. And I think right now, we have an opportunity to develop innovative ideas that challenge and disrupt the systems that we're living in and that exploit a lot of our most marginalized communities. And so I think for me, the takeaway is that I want us to be thinking about ways that our communities can bounce forward and find a way for a positive change to come out of this crisis by really thinking through and reimagining, what is the future we want to create, and what does that look like for communities, and how can we get there?
Yeah, definitely. That was really, really well said. And unfortunately, we're out of time. Sona, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a really interesting conversation, and it's been great to learn more about your work. For those interested in learning more about Sona's work, go to greenlining.org. I think it's in the chat already. And for those of you that are new to Greenbelt Alliance, we're a nonprofit organization supported by donors like yourself. And you can learn more about our work and support us online by giving today at greenbelt.org/donate. And, this is the beginning of a series. So every Thursday at 5 p.m., we will be joined by a new climate leader. And you can join us next week in our climate leader series where we will be joined by Dr. Yoon Kim from 427, where we will learn about climate finance resilience. So I'd like to thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next week. Goodbye.